If you have a Bible, turn to the book of Job. We're in chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 1 and 2 introduced us to the fact that God and Satan had an encounter. Satan became a part of the counsel of God, and he was telling God where he had been, going to and fro the earth. And God asked him, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And evidently Satan hadn't. He probably hadn't seen Job as someone that was worthy of his time and attention. But when God brought the spotlight on Job, Satan says, "Well, God, Job is just like all those humans you created. They only serve you because you give them something. If you take away what you give them, they wouldn't serve you. They'd curse you." And that's a question that is still apt today. There are people who serve God only because they think they're going to get something from him. And it's not heaven that they're looking for. It's some material blessing. Do you serve God for no reason at all of what you're going to get? But you serve God because God is God. And he is deserving and worthy of our service, not because of what he gets or gives us, but because of what he is, who he is. So that was chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 3, we were introduced to what's called Hebrew poetry. Now, you may have a Bible that divides it up so it's obvious that this is poetry, the way the lines are written. They're short, they're two lines together. That's Hebrew poetry. But Hebrew poetry is not the way in which we judge English poetry. It's not because the words rhyme. In fact, if you was to pick up a Hebrew Bible and look at the text, you'd have no idea whether you was looking at narrative or poetry. You wouldn't know what is the kind of text that you're dealing with. But what they've discovered is that Hebrew poetry, it tends to use two lines, and they either say the same thing. Line 1 says something, line 2 repeats it in some way. Or they tend to be opposite. Line says it one way, and line 2 says it the opposite way. Or they tend to emphasize or embellish something. So line 1 has a statement, line 2 has a more dramatic statement. And so from chapter 3 to the first part of chapter 42 of the book of Job, you have poetry. It's all poetry. And so you have to know that, because as you read it, it's going to help you to be able to understand what is being said. If you don't realize that you're dealing with poetry, you're going to be scratching your head and say, what in the world are they talking about? It just doesn't seem to make sense. So I hope, number one, I hope you get a Bible that has it divided up into the poetic form. So you'll know that you are dealing with poetry, and you know the lines that are being contrasted some way, being compared in some way. So as we come to chapter 6 and 7, chapter 4 and 5 was Eliphaz's response. The first response that one of Job's friends made to him concerning the plight that he was in. And they are distraught, these friends are. They don't know what to think about the difficulty that Job is in, other than their theology tells them Job's suffering, Job has sinned. There's no discussion. That's it. What they are dealing with is, Job, why have you sinned? What is your sin? We hadn't been able to figure it out. We hadn't been able to identify what your sin is. And so Eliphaz gave him some counsel. And basically it was, Job, the reason why you're hurting, the reason why you are in such trouble is because sin is in your life. And there are a lot of people who today live that way. But Job, throughout the book, is going to refuse that idea. But he's got to deal with it. And so in chapter 6 and 7, Job makes a response. Chapter 6, he's making a response to his friend Eliphaz and what he had to say. Chapter 7, Job then zeroes in on his Creator, on God, and has some things to share with God. That's sort of what Job is doing. He's going through the business of trying to evaluate, what have I done? Where am I? What do I need to change in order to be able to be in a good position with God? So First off is to his comforters. And I use the word plural because even though Eliphaz is the only one who has spoken to Job at this point, the other two are present, and evidently Job is including them in his dialogue with Eliphaz. He recognizes that these other two friends are on the same page that Eliphaz is on. And so he's responding first off to his comforters. There's 4 responses that he tends to make. First off, through his reasoning in chapter 6, the first 7 verses. And in his reasoning, what Job is going to be saying is, he's saying, hey guys, my complaint is justified. Have you ever been there? People wonder maybe what you've done to suffer what you've suffered, but you say, my suffering and the way I'm responding to it, it's justified. I'm hurting. And I'm justified in saying I'm hurting. And I'm justified in saying I don't understand why I'm hurting. And I'm justified in crying out and say, why is this happening to me? And Job says, it's okay to do that. It's okay to wonder, why are things happening, taking place in your life? So then Job answered and said, oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid with it on the scales. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. He's saying, I want you to evaluate my suffering, my calamity. I want you to measure it. I want you to compare it to what other people go through. And Job has the realization and the understanding. He said, what I am going through is far worse than anybody has ever gone through. And that tends to be the way we deal with the suffering that comes into our life. We think we are suffering more than anybody else has ever suffered. We think we're the exception. Other people have had bad things to come into their life, and that's okay, but nobody's had the kind of difficulty that I'm having. That's where Job is. And so he says, let's weigh it. And he says, if you was to weigh it, it would be heavier than the sand. It would tip the scales on my side as to its severity. And then he says in verse 4, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. My spirit drinks in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Now, Job has no problem thinking that God is bringing this on him. He has no problem. He understands that. His problem is, I just don't understand why. I don't accept the reason that Eliphaz gave me. The reason why I'm suffering is because I've done wrong. But he says, the arrows of God are within me. My spirit drinks in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Then he says, does the wild donkey bray when it has grass? Or does the ox low over its fodder? Can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? My soul refuses to touch them. They are as loathsome to food to me. Now what he is saying is, what is happening to me, I don't like. I'm not enjoying it at all. I don't find any value in what is happening to me. Now, the thing that I think God would remind us of, there is nothing that happens to us that is not of value. Everything God permits you and I to go through, God has a purpose, has a reason, because God is the one who has to authorize it. God is the one who has to give the okay to it. And even if it is what we would consider to be something bad, God says, I have something good to come out of it. We know, Romans 8, Paul says, we know that God works good in all things. God works good in all things. Notice that particular verse doesn't say all things are good. But God works good in all things. There is no situation of life that you are dealing with that God is not able and willing to work good in the midst of that circumstance that you're undergoing. But Job says, I don't want to have anything to do with it. It's like flavorless food. It's ugh. There's nothing good about it. And so that's the reasoning that he's coming from. My plight, my difficulty is greater than anything anybody has faced, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So then he makes a request. And this is the request that he's speaking basically to his friend, but he's wanting them to know how he stands. He says, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant me the thing that I long for." Now, in chapter 3, what was Job looking for? Death. Job questioned why he was even born. And then he questioned when he was born, why didn't he experience death immediately? He is still of that mindset. And so he says, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant me the thing that I long for, that it would please God to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. Then I would still have comfort, though in anguish I would exult. He will not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One." So again, he is alluding to the fact that I really can't put my finger on what I've done wrong, but it would be better for me if God would just let me die. That's where I want to be. So he says, "What strength do I have that I should hope? And what is my end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Is my help not within me, and is success driven from me?" Two things he's saying. He's saying, I am hopeless and I'm powerless. Now, I really can't think of anything that is more devastating to you or I in our experiences when we come to the feeling that we are hopeless. There's no glimmer of light. It's all dark. It's like we're in the forever tunnel and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. We are absolutely hopeless. But also, we look at our situation and we recognize that there's nothing I can do. There's not one thing I can do that's going to change this. The way I feel because of this burden that is placed upon me. Now then, we'd have to recognize Job is feeling this burden physically because he has these boils all over his body, but also he's feeling it emotionally because he's in this quandary of why? Why? That seems to be the one word that is embedded in Job's mind. Why? 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 Hopeless, powerless. You've been there before. We've all been through those kind of situations where we felt hopeless and powerless. So he makes a response in verses 14 to 23. And this response is directed to his three counselors. He's going to point out some things about them. And notice the very first idea he points out in verse 14. To him who is afflicted, that would be Job, I'm afflicted. To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Kindness should be shown by his friends. Think of your own personal life. When things are going downhill in your life, you've got a bad hair day. I never have a bad hair day. Fortunately, that's the one reason you don't have hair, so you don't have those bad hair days. But you do have a bad day. How do you want to be approached when you have a bad day? When you have these feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness, and someone comes to you with this inane grin and this cheery face, and they're just bubbling all over, what do you want to do to them? Well, some of us want to, we want to wipe that silly grin off your face. We want you to quit being so happy, because I'm not there. You know how you want to be approached. Sometimes you want to be just left alone. When I'm having a bad day, give me space. Just don't say anything to me. Some of you want to be smothered with attention. You want those around you to recognize you're having a bad day. You want them to be sure that they know how down you are and how bad and difficult things are. So you want to be smothered with attention. How do you? And do you know, let's say in your family, do you know how the members of your family want to be treated when they're having a rough time? Do they know you want to be left alone? Do they know you want to be smothered with attention? And the extremes of those two, well, you want them to acknowledge it, but don't go overboard with it. At least acknowledge the fact I'm having a bad day. Don't ignore it that way. So that's what Job's saying to his friends. He says, to your friends, you got to show them kindness. That's what Job was wanting, kindness. And notice he says, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty, he's saying, even if the guy isn't on the same spiritual level that you are, don't bring him down because he's not where you are spiritually. Don't ignore him because he's not focusing on God like you are. Be kind to him. Recognize that even those who are not in the right relationship with God have difficulty and issues. They need assistance. Isn't it amazing that the Bible makes it very, very plain that we are to be harder on those who are believers than we are on those who are not believers? Paul makes it very, very plain. He says if a believer is sinning, he says you get after him. You remove yourself even from him. Don't even have a meal with him if he's living fragrantly a life of sin. But he says for the non-believer, you still associate with them. And so this is what Job is looking at these counselors of his, and he's saying, you didn't come to me right. You didn't take the time to find out how I needed to be entreated. My brothers have dealt deceitfully like a brook, like the streams of the brooks that pass away, which are dark because of the ice and into which the snow vanishes. When it is warm, they cease to flow. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. The paths of their way turn aside. They go nowhere and perish. The caravans of Tema look. The travelers of Sheba hope for them. They are disappointed because they were confident. They come and they are confused. For now you are nothing. You are terror and are afraid. Did I ever say, and he's throwing this in their face, did I ever say, bring something to me? Or offer a bribe for me from your wealth? Or deliver me from the enemy's hand? Or redeem me from the hand of the oppressor? He says it's like streams that come in the desert. When the rain comes, there seems to be an overabundance of water that goes into the ditches. But it doesn't last very long. It's there and then it's gone. And he says the caravans come through, they're looking for water, they're confident they're going to find water, and then they don't. How disappointed they are. Thinking that there's going to be a resource for them and it's not there. And Job is saying, that's what I expected from you guys. I thought you guys are going to be a resource. You're no resource, you're deceitful. You come to me in the guise of having knowledge and wisdom, and yet you have absolutely none. And it's interesting, God's going to agree with Job about these three guys. You have nothing for me. And so look at his reaction in verse 24. Teach me and I will hold my tongue. Cause me to understand wherein I have cried or erred. How forceful are right words, but what does your arguing prove? Do you intend to rebuke my words and the speeches of a desperate one? Or as a wind? Yes, you overwhelm the fatherless, you undermine your friend. Now therefore be pleased to look at me, for I would never lie to your face. Yield now, let there be no injustice. Yes, concede, my righteousness still stands. Is there injustice on my tongue? Cannot my taste discern the unsavory? He says, okay, teach me. You have wisdom, you have knowledge, you have understanding. I'm ready. Teach me. Show me what I've done wrong. Point out my sin. And isn't it amazing that we live even today in an age in which people have all kinds of ideas, but no solutions? That's what's happening to Job. These three friends have got all kinds of ideas to present to him, but they don't have a solution. It's almost as though they like just to hear themselves speak. And there are people like that. They just love to hear themselves speak. They love to give their opinion about things. But they don't like to be challenged as to, now, how is that going to come about? How are you going to produce what you are advocating, what you are saying. So, chapter 6, his three friends, especially Eliphaz. That's his response to them. Chapter 7, though, Job is going to focus on his Creator, on God. And there's three things that he wants God to know. He wants God to know his futility. He wants God to know his fading. He wants God to know his fragileness. His futility says that, God, I've not received even anything from you. Now, isn't it easy to blame someone that you think is responsible for your predicament with their unfailing to supply a need, a solution? So he says, is there not a time of hard service for man on earth? Are not his days also like the days of a hired man, like a servant who earnestly desires the shade, and like a hired man who eagerly looks for his wages? Job says, like a servant or a hired hand expects something in return in what they are in. He says, that's like me. I'm hurting and I expect some relief. I'm suffering and I expect someone to ease my pain. And God, I really expect you to do that. So I have been allotted months. Now notice, did you get that? We ask ourselves, how long has Job been in this situation? Well, I think it's less than a year, but I think it's many months. I think the use of the word there. I have been allotted months of futility. Months. Now think about that. What's the longest that you've had to endure with a difficult situation where there was absolutely no relief? The longest that you had to go with absolutely not even the smallest amount of relief. Like the rich man in hell says to Lazarus that if he could come and put a drop of water, that would at least be some kind of relief. Job is in a position where he's not even getting that. There's not a drop of sympathy. There's not a drop of understanding that he feels he is experiencing. He says, and wearisome nights have been appointed to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? And the night be ended? For I have had my fill of tossing till dawn. Goodness, it's just as though Job is experiencing the very same things we do. I toss and turn a lot of times. I wonder, is morning ever going to come? So I can at least get up, have a reason, an excuse to get up. But I lay on one side and then the other side, just tossing and turning, not going to sleep. That's where Job is. He says, my flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin cracked and breaks out of flesh. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. He dreads going to bed. He dreads getting up. There's no equal ground here. Now think of this. This is the oldest book of the Bible. And as though it was written this very day. Because it characterizes our generation. It characterizes what all of us go through from one time or the other. So what do you do when you toss and turn? How do you deal with that? What solution have you come up with in order to help you at least get some sleep? So that's his futility. He says it's just futile. I'm awake, I'm hurting. At night, I'm hurting. I can't go to sleep. I know I need to go to sleep. I need rest, but it just won't come. So he sees himself as fading into nothing. He says, oh, remember that my life is but a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be, and the cloud disappears and vanishes away. So he who goes down to the grave does not come up. He shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him evermore. Now, they didn't have a clear-cut theology about life after death. And they saw the end of the life, the end of it all. Where do you go? You go into the dirt. There's nothing for you there. But he says that's going to be better than what I'm experiencing now. Go ahead and let me have that. So he says that death ends all contact with this life. You're separated from this life. I often think about and wonder, those who go on to be with the Lord, do they know anything about what's going on here? I often ask myself, is Dorothy watching me? Goodness, I hope not. And I think she couldn't be, because there's no sorrow or disappointment in heaven. But I don't know. I tend to lean to the side. I don't think that they are engaged in watching what's going on here on this planet in terms of our minor things that we do, and in terms of just doing life. But I'm not so sure they're not engaged in seeing the gospel being spread throughout the world. I think that's significant to the heavenly realm. It says about the angels, they rejoice when someone is saved, so obviously there's some kind of contact that they have with people being saved, with salvation, with spiritual progression. And I tend to lean to that direction. I think they are engaged in seeing people as they are saved. They're engaged in seeing, I think they are seeing the conflict that is going on between the darkness and the light. I think that they are able to see those entities that are rulers and powers and promoting their agenda in the world in which we live. But as far as looking at your day-to-day life and your choices and decisions, I don't think so. I had two grandchildren that were born after Dorothy died, so I don't think she knows about Cameron and Susan. So at least I have something to tell her. See, if she knew about it, I mean, if she knew all that is going on, there wouldn't be anything I'd have to tell her. She'd know it all. I think there'll be some information that I could bear. I could tell her. I could introduce her, because Susan and Cameron have trusted Christ as their Savior, so they're going to be part of that heavenly realm. But Job, in his day, death was just such a bummer, such a dark thing, and they didn't see any benefit out of it. He says, he shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him anymore. Now, the difference is, we, in our day, and many of you do this, you recognize those who have died. I mean, there's not a time that the family doesn't get together that we don't talk about Dorothy. She impacted our lives, and so she is remembered. And certainly there's not been a day of her death, since her death, that I haven't thought of her in some way. So I disagree with Job here in what we do today. We do remember those who have died. So his final problem is that he brings to God is his fragileness. His fragileness. Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I a sea or a sea serpent that you set a guard on me? Now what he is saying is, God, why are you even interested in me? He believes what has happened to him has been permitted by God, has come from God. So his question is, God, why are you even interested in me? Do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel that you are so insignificant and unimportant that God doesn't take any interest in you? But God has interest in all of us. But Job is feeling that way. He said, God, why are you even interested in me? He says, when I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams. Job said, when I do get to go to bed and I do fall asleep, guess what happens? I have nightmares. I am scared with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my body. I loathe my life, I would not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are but a breath. What is man that you should exalt him, that you should set your heart on him, that you should visit him every morning and test him every moment? Now, that's a good question for us to ask. What are we that God is so interested in us? And if God is so interested in us, then we ought to do all that we can to fulfill the interest that he has in us. We ought to fulfill the reason why God is looking at us and is interested in what we're doing every single day. And he's interested in the choices and the decisions we are making. He is interested in how we are promoting the gospel through our lives and through the world in which we live. So he says, how long will you not look away from me and let me alone till I swallow my saliva? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me diligently, but I will no longer be. He is looking at the experience of death as getting away not only from his misery, but getting away from the God who he thinks has brought it upon him. Now again, Job has no problem thinking that God is the reason for his misery, that God has allowed this to happen to him. His concern, his question, his issue is why? Why? And Job has done probably a thorough searching of his life, looked at every aspect of it, and he cannot find anything that would be justifying the plight that he is in. But we already know. God has said about Job, there's no one as blameless as Job is. There's no one as upright as Job is. There is no one who blesses God with his lips as Job does. So Job's right in thinking, I can't find anything. I can't identify anything that would justify this great disaster that has come upon me. Now he's going to, after we get to the end of the book, he's going to find out a reason why. But right now, he's in the dilemma of saying, I don't understand it. I can't figure it out. But what we have to identify is, again, God allows nothing to happen to us that he doesn't have an interest in and he doesn't have a purpose for. And we may not ever realize it in this life. There may be those issues that go unanswered in this life. I don't know in the life to come, is God going to explain it? I sort of hope he does. But that would imply then that I'm going to carry into the life to come some of the issues that I've had in this life. But then I think about, man, when you get to heaven, when you stand before the Lord, is there anything more wonderful than that? And my answer is no, there can't be. So it's going to be such a thrilling, invigorating experience. Why would I think about the old things that happened in this life? But there's a certain aspect, there's a certain part of me that says, but I would like to know. At least I want to know now. I don't know if I'm going to want to know then, but I want to know now. Why? Now, the key is you've got to belong to God. You've got to recognize your need of him. You've got to cast your faith and your trust in him and him alone. And that's what God wants to do for each one of us. So let's bow together in prayer. Father, how we thank you that you love us, that Christ has given himself for us, that we have the opportunity to have life. And we go through these struggles as Job is going through. We know that you are that one who is constantly with us, who provides for us all that we need. We just ask, Father, that you would be glorified in our lives even today. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand together and sing, asking God what he wants of us today. And I trust and pray that our heart is, Lord, whatever it is that you want, I'm willing to do it and be a part of it. So as we sing.